Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. The reason I've asked you to move forward is because we're in the graveyard shift, we're just going to make the session as inclusive as possible. So we'll be taking questions from the floor the whole way through. So it'll be much more of an open conversation than a presentation from the panel. So thanks very much for choosing us this afternoon. As it says in the programme, we'll be focusing on predominantly weed control in field veg, but we've got a panel of very accomplished growers, so I'm sure they'll be more than happy to answer questions on anything that's come up today or anything else. You know, this is a really good opportunity to ask those questions as we close towards the end of the day. So let me just first introduce the panel. To my left here, first of all, I've got Andy Dibben. Andy's from Abbey Home Farm in Gloucestershire. It's 1,600 acres of livestock, cereals and rewilding. And incorporated within that is 15 acres of horticultural field crops. That's 86 crop lines. And he may touch on the recent adaptation of silver horticulture. And his main customers are on-site farm shop and cafe. In the middle, I've got Ian Tolhurst. Ian probably doesn't need an introduction at all, but he's one of the business partners of Tolhurst Organics in Oxfordshire, been running over 30 years, so he's probably one of the Soil Association's longest horticultural licensees, and he's been a stock-free system since 2014. And then on the far left, we've got Ian Plowright, Ian from Plowright Organics, Richard, sorry, Plowright Organics in Somerset, been growing organic veg since the year 2000, and for the past 26 years, he's been in the current farm at Stowy Rocks Farm. So I think we'll just have a brief introduction from each of the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Andy, fire away.
It's on weeds in particular, or just general?
Weeds? Weeds.
Okay, I think I'd like to say a couple of my two best sort of techniques towards weeds in general. One is rotations are absolutely critical to managing weeds. And then the other I'd say is the best, and I say this about most things, whether it's insect pests, whether it's weeds, the most important thing is a strong, vigorous, competitive crops. If you start with that, the rest of it kind of slots into place after that. Sorry.
Right, okay. Yeah, a couple of corrections, sorry. Yeah, we've actually been going since 1976, so it's 45 years. And we've been stock-free organic since, well, roughly the year 2000. So yeah, it's like changed on dates there. Yeah, weed control, when I first started in horticulture all those years ago, I had three things I wanted to kill completely and annihilate. One was weeds, the other was pests, the other was diseases. I've completely changed my kind of philosophy on that. I've got to the point in my life where I can now make really valid excuses for why we have weeds around. Weed control is really about what you can deal with, what you can tolerate, and what your crop can tolerate. So it's really about trying to develop a systems approach. And as mentioned, rotation is critically important. You cannot have a good system without rotation. And it's really about being able to do the right thing at the right time and accepting that you will never, ever annihilate weeds, and there is actually no desire and no point in even thinking along those lines. We've completely eliminated, apart from strawberry growing, completely eliminated any physical mulches in terms of weed control, and we rely almost completely on rotation, mechanical intervention, and systems. Just to add, we're doing primarily field veg on just under 20 acres, but we also have intensive veg, some of which is on no-dig raised beds and has been for about 10 years.
Okay, yeah, so so yeah, we're as regards scale, we're an 80-acre farm, and we grow about 20 to 30 acres of veg every year. We have a severe weed burden. I would guarantee I've got a worse weed burden than anybody in the room. And it requires commitment and passion to grow the vegetables and a lot of work to manage the weeds. But I made a few notes, and I wanted to say that I've come to see weeds as an essential component of the organic system, which in my view runs contrary to most of what I've heard today. Most people seem to be trying to bury them very deep or eradicate them from their systems completely. And I think they're absolutely vital in fostering soil health. I've learned that sort of by accident over the last 20 years or so, because my soils have just improved with my crop and weed growing, and I couldn't work out why, and I put it down to the weeds. So it's important, you know, it's important to combat, in my view, the conventional perspective of weed-free soil crops in nice green lines, which in the back of our minds, I think we all quite like to see. But I see it as a conventional perspective. None of our crops are weed-free. Some of our crops you can't see for weeds, but we've built a viable business, and we supply now about 450 veg boxes a week, and we make a good living and employ about 11 people, despite the weeds, and they're an essential part of our system. So I just wanted to say that to create some balance. And the way that we manage weed, well, I guess we can go into the details, but we use machinery, and I think I bought everything on the market that's available to try and not to defeat the weeds, but just to get ahead slightly. And it really is like that, yeah. But the rest is specific, isn't it? I think. But I just wanted to give you my overview. Oh, by the way, with our weed system, we have to plough, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, that's, yeah. Right, that's it, Shirley.
We're done. So just thinking about the weed burden of, have you seen the profile of weeds changing over recent years? Are there specific issues that have become more prevalent?
You know, it's a complicated thing, isn't it? I mean, it's the same as it depends what you're talking about. You know, you've got late crops, early crops, fast-growing crops, slow-growing crops. You've got perennial weeds, annual weeds, long-season weeds, short-season weeds. So it's quite complicated to answer the question. There's drilled crops and transplanted crops. There's difficult weeds and easy weeds. The short-duration crops and long-duration crops. So it's
not complicated.
It's not complicated. So depending on, but overall, we've got some major perennial weeds, docks, thistles, and couch grass, which are pretty tricky to deal with. But our major annual weed, well, we've got two at the moment. One is black nightshade, which doesn't, and it's a problem because it doesn't give up, it doesn't stop growing. Eventually it does. And then we've got a problem with red shank. But red shank isn't quite as bad, in my opinion, as black nightshade, because it does at least give up around about now and allows your July planted crops to get away from it. I don't know whether, but I've got no evidence, but I have a feeling that the autumns are getting warmer, and that's changing the competition between the crops and weeds into the later season. But I don't really have any evidence, except that some of my crops are getting buried, which previously wouldn't.
Ian, are you seeing anything that's more prevalent now than before?
Yeah, we have seen a change in the weed situation. I also inherited a very weedy field, and I saw Richard's field within a few weeks of him moving in, so I know what his field looked like. Ours wasn't quite as bad, and we have extensive areas of perennial weed, which took several years to sort out. We eventually did manage to get rid of the docks, which had been seeding for many years. We took on what was essentially an old horse pasture that had been heavily grazed and badly managed. It had been hay cut for many years, so fertility was low. Fertility has a big influence on weed pressure, particularly when you're trying to grow a crop. You can grow a much better crop where you have good fertility and weeds than you can with poor fertility and weed. The weeds will always come up no matter what level of fertility. And we've seen the weed situation change over many decades, and we've watched it go from, initially it was perennial weeds, then we inherited massive, chickweed was legendary. I mean, we actually sold some off to somebody who wanted to try it. In fact, we sold several tons. We could harvest it in handfuls. And chickweed, if you're trying to grow carrots or anything direct sown, chickweed is an absolute nightmare. Gradually that disappeared, then groundsel came in. And groundsel's a nightmare because each plant has got 20,000 seeds and they all germinate the following year. And then that disappeared because it got rust and died out. So over a period of time, we've seen weeds come and go. But what we started with was a very small number of weeds. We only really had about 4 or 5 annual weeds. And that's changed dramatically now, where we have we know we have over 60 because we've had surveys done. And I think that's really a much healthier situation, having 60 weeds of different species, because they kind of compete with each other. Every season is different. It depends on the weather, depends on time of cultivation, depends on the crop. We've become much more adventurous with direct drilling in the field because we found that plant raising and planting by hand in a wall garden was quite expensive, so we direct drill. We're doing things like fennel, direct drill, celery, lots of crops which we've never done before. And in order to do that, you do need some measure of weed control. So we've developed reasonably good systems. Most of our equipment is ancient. We have no modern weeding equipment at all. We have 2 steerage hose for different purposes. We have lots of spring tines set up in different ways to create mostly a ridging effect. And most of our mechanical weeding system is dependent on a ridging system where we can ridge. This is on field scale. So yes, the weeds have changed dramatically over that period of time. The docks we eventually got rid of. They were slow and laborious, and the policy there was never ever to let them seed, because one dock is between 5,000 and 10,000 seeds. They have a longevity of in excess of 40 or 50 years. We've reduced the weed seed bank with docks down to very low levels, and we rarely see them. But then appreciating, when is the best time to get docks to germinate? The best time to get docks to germinate is August and September, and then you can get rid of them. We've replaced the docks actually now with chicory, which I'm really passionate about. Chicory also seeds very extensively, but it's much easier to get rid of. And what chicory has done is continuing the work that the docks started in terms of restructuring, reprofiling, and reinvigorating our soil. Weeds are always there for a reason, and the docks were there because the soil had been so badly managed and so badly denatured, it had to get restructured, and the docks were part of that process. So I think when you've got a serious weed problem, you have to look at why it's there, and what factors have introduced that weed to become a major problem. And there's always a reason. Chemical growers have the same issues as we have in a different sort of way, but they're still dealing with problems of weeds. After 200 years of chemical intervention, they are still having serious weed problems. In fact, in many cases, far worse than it was 50 years ago.
Sorry, yes.
Why you didn't invest in any other tools or newer ones? How come you still stuck with the ancient ones?
It's primarily because of our soil type. If anyone's ever been to our farm, I know a few of you have, we have completely rubbish shit soil. It's grade 3B, it's 40% stone over 10 millimetres, and that stone is flint. It's horrendously abrasive. If we put any fancy kit in there, what we do is we end up dragging piles of stones up. So we're using very basic kit which can deal with that situation. And because we grow such a wide range of crops, we have to have a wide range of different implements for different crops. To have just 1 or 2 very specialist tools is fine if you're growing 40 acres of carrots and 40 acres of onions, you can do that. But on our scale, where we're 1 acre of carrots and 1 acre of onions, it's not possible to go into that sort of degree of investment. So we've made do with pretty basic equipment, which does a fairly good job, provided you do it at the right time. And that's a critical factor in weed control. It's about timeliness.
Just,
why are we not specialised in this particular weed, but like you have in particular weed equipment?
All right, okay.
Mm.
Do you want to know what I've got?
I was just going to ask about sort of rotations and weed control. So I guess part of our weed control system is 2-year fertility break, but I'm always torn between, do I mow it? It's red shank and chickweed. It's always, do I mow it or do I let the free manure flower and get the benefits of pollinators and the like? And any comments on which is the right choice would be interesting.
We are kind of not red shank, but what there used to be a lot of farmyard manure applied on some of the bits we grow on now. We're now pretty much like Tolly, stock free. It's just all the fertilities, green manures. We use a tiny bit of cattle bedding to bulk up compost for the protected cropping, but almost everything's green manures. Fat hen's the one we find that comes up, and what we do is we do a first cut quite low on the green manure, make sure we get to take the tops off all the fat hen. And then we find after that that the clovers and grasses just come up and outcompete the fat hens from that point. And sorry, what's that? Not red shank, yes. I mean, you become a specialist in the weeds that you have, but like Tolly said, your weeds do change over time. So I'm sure at some point I will come up against red shank and I will perfect my techniques with that.
I'm glad red shank's come out because we've also got a bit of a problem with red shank sometimes. We never ever see it come up in green manure crops that are in for long term. Never. In fact, we don't have any weeds apart from ones we sow with the green manure, which we do purposely put weeds in.
Yeah, red shank is a terrible weed.
It's a pain in the ass. Yeah. It's worse on wet ground. You know, the wetter your ground, the bigger the red shank gets.
One of the things with green manures is really important is, and I've got better and better at this, is to start with, you see them as something you need to do, especially if you're using other forms of fertility as well. When it's your only form of fertility going in, you literally give it the same amount of attention as you give your carrot crop. And you treat it as a seriously important crop. And as an example of that, especially with some of the weather patterns we have these days, where we are in Gloucestershire, we are getting some seriously extensive droughts. And the worst ones are the ones that come really early in the year. So I think, was it 2 or 3 years ago, really, really full on drought in sort of April, May. May, I do a lot of green manure sowing in May and June. So actually now, because I treat it as a crop and we've got the system to do it, we actually irrigate in our green manures. I used to wait and sow it before I saw rain coming. But when you see blazing 30 degrees on the forecast for 3 weeks, I don't want to wait 3 weeks and then put in my green manure. And actually by putting an inch of water on it after you've sown it, it germinates really fast. And like Tolly says, it will outcompete the weeds straight away. So I think with the green manure, to give it the attention and position in your head that you give to a critically high value crop or any crop, and just treat it the same way is quite important.
Yeah, I'd endorse that. I mean, the green manure crop for us, the 2-year fertility building crop within the rotation is the most important crop we grow. And I get farmers come around and say, well, how can you put 35% of your land, how can you afford to put 35% of your land into not producing the crop? I said, well, how can I afford not to? Because that fertility is going to keep me going for the next 4 or 5 crops. It's going to improve biodiversity. It's going to improve weed control. And the first year after 2 years of fertility building, in fact, in our case, it's over 2.5 years, it's weed free for the first 3 months. Nothing comes up apart from potatoes. Brilliant. It's really easy. I mean, you can take that and use that to your advantage if you're growing carrots or something, which is difficult. There are problem crops we have to acknowledge, and I think all 3 of us here would probably say carrot is the one. Yeah. And spring onions, direct, are 2 quite difficult crops. There are ways around it, but they are challenging.
We don't, I don't use, when I first started, I had a 2-year fertility building phase. And like Tolly said, immediately after that, you think you're in heaven. On our latest holding, we've had a severe wireworm problem to add to the weed problem. And so I've been fearful of putting in fertility layers for a year or 2. Because we lost tens of thousands of pounds worth of crop through wireworm damage. It makes you pretty jumpy. So we actually relied on overwintered green manures, which has mainly been rye and vetch, to be fair. And we haven't put down any long-term In fact, I think going forward now, I do feel confident enough to start putting in longer term green manures, but I haven't done up to now, just as an aside.
Thank you, Paul, from Growing Well. Kate kind of stole my question, so I'll go a bit deeper. Aside from kind of rotations with green manures, are there other crop rotations or examples can you expound upon when you say using rotation as a weed control method? Well, I think we've got the green manure gist. Is there anything else you were thinking of, or is that mainly around green manures? Is there some technique you're finding that works quite well if you follow something with something, or?
Well, Jen, I mean, we probably all do this. I don't know. I can't speak for everybody, I suppose, but we get cracking early, basically. That's what my approach is, to start working the ground, ploughing, and preparing the ground as early as you can. And some of our ground allows us to start putting up beds very early in the season, so we can have false seed beds that we might burn off, depending on the crop, 2 or 3 times before we come to drilling a crop, for instance. And that, I mean, but yeah, having false seed beds and allowing, you know, maybe preparing the last seed bed at least 2 weeks or so before you want to transplant or drill. There are lots of things. I mean, I flame. You probably don't do flame weeding, I don't know, but we do quite a bit of flame weeding before. So with carrots, I'll flame weed before I drill, and I'll flame weed after as well, if I can. I don't always. Some would say you can just flame after drilling, but on occasions you can have problems doing that. I don't know whether does that help? There's lots of cultivation. I mean, yeah.
There's a kind of a whole package of things you have to do, and so much depends on different seasons, different crops. But you know, Richard mentioned stale seed. I call them stale seed beds as bastard fallowing. I'm not swearing. I'm not doing that. Mr. Woodward is swearing, but bastard fallowing. You know, these are techniques which farmers were using hundreds of years ago, which most people seem to have forgotten about completely recently. There's other things. I mean, seed rate, how close together you put your seed in, when you do it, how deep you put it. You know, how you generate the right plant stand in order to give you good weed control. Inter-row systems, you know, the system of how you're going to control weeds if they do become a problem. There's so many factors involved in this, soil temperatures, you know, rainfall, sunshine, you know, all these things, you know, you have to know something about, you know, and some of it is guesswork, or some of it is just intuitive feeling. And how the hell do you teach that to anybody? I don't know. But some of it is really about thinking on your feet. And this year, I'm sure you all know, it's been quite a difficult one. You know, we've been running around, I've been running around the field most summer, redoing a whole lot of drilling, which went wrong for various reasons. It wasn't all about the weather. Some of it was about poor seed quality. All these things have a real bearing. I mean, seed quality can make or break a crop and give you a serious weed problem. And I'll give you one really good example where we had beetroot seed, which was badly graded in terms of the size range, was from very small to very big. So the seed drill was blocking up, and we were getting big gaps between crops, which meant less crop, more weeds. All these things have a real, you know, they might seem like quite small details, but they can have a really big impact on things like weed control and fertility and crop yield, of course.
A lot of sorry.
I was going to say, another key thing we haven't mentioned yet is timing. Timing of weeding is everything in many ways. As an example, I think I'd say like a main crop brassica, like winter cabbages or kales, I weed twice. If I get it right, I weed it twice. We plant the brassicas out, and then essentially it's a question of holding your nerve and letting the weeds get as big as possible. But what I'm waiting for is I'm waiting for the cabbages, the young cabbages, to get big enough that when I go in with my first weed, I can swamp the soil in around the plants to get the inline weeds. But to get a really good, strong swamp of soil for the inline weeds, the plants have got to be relatively big, otherwise you swamp them as well. So that's the first weed, and that's a really important timing. And then the second weed, I literally wait until the point where within 3 days, I won't be able to get my tractor over the cabbages. So I weed them at the very, very last minute. And that's just 2 weeds. And I find like, if the crop is growing steadily and strongly and vigorously, those 2 weeds is all we need. And if I get it right, there's no need to go near that field with a hoe. It's just done with 2 passes with spring times and a swamping action. So timing is everything. And like our general rule, which hasn't been mentioned yet, our general rule is weed free for the first 8 weeks. After that, your crop will be big and strong enough to outcompete any weeds. And actually from that point, the weed becomes, in my view, an important part. And I think both Tolly and Richard have touched on this. It's actually a really important part of your farm system, you know. But there's loads of weeds, I just let them flower, I'm not really worried about it. They're a crucial pollen source and attractant for predatory insects in and around your crops.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the point about flowering weeds, I mean, 30, 40 years ago, I'd have been horrified at the thought of letting something, a weed flower. The only one we don't let flower now is dogs. But the others, oh, come on, you know, I'm going to lose sleepless nights if I start worrying about weeds flowering and setting seed. Chickweed in a tunnel can do that in just 2 weeks in the winter. So you're never, ever going to stop weeds flowering and setting seed. And actually, the weed seed bank is an essential component of your soil health and fertility. It really is, because as soon as you leave that soil bare, if you don't get green manure in, it will grow weeds. What you want soil cover. So you have to look upon your weeds in a completely different way. So you have to look at them in a more positive light. I mean, looking at weeds, pests and diseases in a negative way will get you nowhere in the long run. You have to start thinking positive. Okay, you have to manage them for your system, but it's very much about a positive attitude towards what we have been taught to believe are negative issues. It's like, you know, rats. Everybody hates rats because that's what you were taught to hate. And we were taught to hate weeds, pests, and disease. That's not the case. We need to learn to love them. They'll love us back.
I have to say,
the other key thing with the weeds is, you know, everyone talks about soil health, and like my understanding is that root exudates, so the sugars released by roots to fungus and interacting with the soil biome, these root exudates are absolutely critical. So a soil empty of plants starts to consume its own organic matter. If you have a plant in the soil and it's releasing sugars, you're feeding it. Now, you've got a young crop with a small rooting system, there's big gaps between your, say you're doing on a 3-line system or a 2-line system, there's big gaps between those crops, and those roots will not be feeding the whole of that soil area. If you've got weeds in there as well, weeds produce root exudates just as much as crops, and they then become an important tool for soil health. I also find that you get, with the Brassicas again, when you do a well-timed weed hit, and the weeds are a little bit bigger than 2-leaf weeds, you get a good nitrogen hit off weeds, you know, and you'll see a flush of growth out of your crop just after you do a weed. As they die down, they release their nitrogen into the soil.
I was just going to say that we wouldn't leave you obviously haven't got any red shank on your farm. You can't leave your crop 7 weeks if you've got red shank. You'll have no, because you can't get rid of red shank after 7 weeks. So what you need is a trefoil harrow. No, sorry, this is I must take this hat off. So we're not, because we've got red shank, we've got to get in almost before we planted sometimes. So that's on occasions I do a pre-planting flame weed for that reason. I know it's not considered to be bad practice by some, but if I don't flame weed, we certainly try and get in pretty quickly, sometimes after a week or less than a week, with a harrow. And to do that, we have to have planted the crops very well. And so we plant everything with a module planter. We need good transplants that we can put in quite deep, so they're not going to get pulled out by the harrow. And actually, all our weeding relies on mechanical planting. It wouldn't work except for the harrow, unless we plant. All the machines require the plants to be put in with them. All my weeding machines, except for the harrow, require the plants to have been put in with a machine. Otherwise, they don't work. Do you agree with that? Yeah. But has anybody got any questions? Because we can.
I just had a comment to add on the stale seed beds, that what Andy said about treating the green manure like it's your most important crop. Another thing I've learned is to treat my stale seed bed like it's my most important crop. So if it's dry, water the seed bed, most importantly, roll it so you get the contact to make the weeds come up. For years, I had stale seed beds that nothing germinated in because it was always dry in April, just when I needed it to be wet. So I just wanted to.
Is that because you? Yeah.
And also, this is my opportunity to try and get someone to talk about asparagus. At least 2 of you do or have grown asparagus. So have you got anything to say about weeds and asparagus, please?
I thought I had, and I've just written off my asparagus patch. Yeah, that's a project still in progress. I thought I'd nailed it, but so what we were doing asparagus. We were doing our last crop of asparagus. It's the last cut of asparagus after 6 weeks of cropping, and then we go across and we fell the whole lot to the ground, no matter how big it was. Give it all to the cafe. They put in omelettes, and then we were putting biomulch down straight over the top immediately, and we're putting a thin layer of green waste over the top of the biomulch, mainly to hold the biomulch down, actually. And then the asparagus would come up and pierce the biomulch, come up through and be weed free. Now that system worked for 2 years. And then last year, it was so hot, just the weather, when we did that process, that the biodegradable mulch biodegraded in about 3-4 days underneath some quite hot, unfinished green waste compost. And just the heat of the weather and the heat of the green waste compost just accelerated the biodegrading of the biomulch, and then we were scuppered. You know, we were left, essentially we just applied a load of compost to weeds, and they all came up. Asparagus?
Pre-cooked?
No, the asparagus came out quite well, but it came up with all the weeds.
Yeah, I have to admit some level of defeat with asparagus as well, actually. I've been trying it for a long time, and this was going to be the last attempt, and we thought we'd got it crap because we now use wood chip for such things, and it's a really good, effective weed control. However, it doesn't control cooch, and cooch loves feeding in wood chip. Okay, you can pull it out by hand, but it's quite a lot of work, you know, and asparagus isn't worth that much, really, considering the amount of work goes into it. So we're thinking probably we'll only leave it another couple of years and then we'll get rid of it and put something a lot more productive. Even on a good yield, asparagus for us has not proved to be particularly productive for the amount of land it takes up and the effort that goes into it.
Specialist crop.
Really special.
Perennial
vegetables are seriously challenging. Perennial vegetables need to be grown on a separate farm, not by anybody doing annual vegetables. Same goes for fruit. Don't mix the two ever, like I do.
Interesting, just aside on stale seed beds, is that last year I put up some beds for my early carrots, which I generally sow at the end of April, something like that. And it didn't rain once in April, and or actually in, what's the month before April? March. And
the wet one.
Yeah, and I irrigated the beds, and nothing germinated. I don't know about that, but nothing germinated until it rained. The weeds only came up when it rained. They didn't come up with the irrigation water. I'm not joking.
Yeah, we've noticed the same. Irrigation is not as good as rain for getting weeds going. I don't know why. It could be because the temperature is probably lower with irrigation than it is with rain. But yeah, there's a definite different pattern of immersion compared with irrigation and natural rainfall. Yeah.
Another, in fact, Richard, I've never thanked you for this. A trick Richard taught me, I just mentioned in passing quite a few years ago, is either drilling or planting into a green flush of weeds.
Yeah.
So let your bed flush with weeds. Don't weed it before you plant, and go straight into it with your seed drill or with your planter, and that actually then weeds, does your inline weeding for you, and then you can weed the other bits of the bed quite easily afterwards with the steerage hook. It's a nice little trick, especially if the weather's against you and you haven't got time. The rain's coming and you see it on the horizon and you want to plant. You can do that, and you'll get that inline weed bed will be weeded, and you go straight in.
I'll tell you a salutary tale about that, shall I? That happened to me, is that taking my own advice, I drilled some I think it was spinach, into a slightly weedier, slightly staler bed than you might like. And I didn't flame it beforehand. And I flamed it afterwards. And the only weeds that survived were the ones closest to the crop, because they'd, the drill pushed the soil out and had the seeds were sort of mixed in with the soil along the drill line. Okay. And it protected the weeds from the flaming. So I ended up manufacturing the situation where I only had weeds in the row. It's quite good.
I think the point Richard made there is a really interesting one, because it's about observance, you know, and the most powerful tool you have on your farm. I ask this very often at seminars I've run. You know, what is the most powerful tool on your farm? We get things like tractors, hoes, and whatever. No, it's not. It's your eyes. You know, the eyes have the greatest power of anything you have on the farm. If you can connect your eyes to the brain, you're going somewhere. You know, if you don't make that connection, you've had it. You're never going to make it grow. But you need to look and observe. Sometimes it's not easy taking time out to do that, to actually go and have a look and try and analyze what's going on, either through a mistake you've made. There's no better way of learning than making a mistake, or just through the way the progression of getting a crop established works. And you know, you need to be looking at how that happens. And weeds are just a part of that observation process. Always ask yourself lots of questions like, why is it here? Why is this weed growing at this point in time? Why is it germinating now? You know, there's reasons always for this.
Yeah, a good example of that is I spent quite a few years getting rid of cooch on our farm on the field scale, which we've kind of successfully done with a few different techniques, but mainly like really focusing on doing it. And actually, as a result of a couple of things, of focusing on the cooch and actually bringing an agroforestry system onto the farm, we got a new perennial weed problem, which is creeping thistle. And the creeping thistle, so this is my new subject that I'm researching, you know, it's my new thing to concentrate weed-wise. And then, like Tolly said, eyes to the brain, working out what's happened. And the three things on the creeping thistle that I've identified, one is that it's seeding out of my permanent agroforestry and wildflower strips. So the solution to that is to put a break between that and the crop. So I've now got a blank bed between that and where the cropping starts. The beneficials and the ground beetles, they can go across that quite easily. The next thing is when we put in the agroforestry and while we were dealing with the cooch, we brought buckwheat into our rotation. We actually shortened our rotation. We had to reorientate a field and get it north to south to plant trees, and just mucking around with rotations and trying not to have onions and brassicas back where they were shortly before. The shortening of the fertility build has definitely, from a 2-year fertility build to a 1-year, has definitely allowed creeping thistle to come in a bit more. And then the last thing that's definitely a part of it, and this is an interesting subject in current agricultural climate, is I've really, really reduced my cultivation depths massively. So literally, like, if we're going, you know, I'm trying now to plough once in a rotation, to come out of grass and clover, and then go into veg. And then after that, we're pretty much just doing non-inversion tillage with a power harrow, going in very shallow, just the depth I physically need to get a plug or a seed drill in there. And I think that's definitely allowed the creeping thistle. You know, those 3-4 things have allowed that to come in. So like Tolly said, understanding what's caused it is the start of dealing with it afterwards.
Could you please explain the difference between a stale seed bed and, sorry, I can't remember, and false seed bed? Yeah.
The difference?
Yeah, I just don't know what they are.
There isn't really a difference, but
terminology.
Well, I always think of a false seed bed as not the seed bed, but a seed bed before the seed bed, and a stale seed bed. A stale seed bed is the seed bed gone stale. Does that make sense? So, for example, this year, I power harrowed my parsnip area. We had about 4 acres of parsnips. I power harrowed it and created what I would call a false seed bed. And then I power harrowed it again to produce another false seed bed. And then I made up some beds which I allowed to go stale for 2 weeks, and then I drilled the parsnips. And they were immaculate, I have to say, not a weed in sight. But then you know, one thing came to another, and we turned our back for a few. I think I turned my back for about a month, thinking, well, they look pretty good, and they look, well, they're okay. But does that make sense? Well, although you know, we're all aware that cultivating brings up seeds, but at the same time, the cultivation actually slowly reduces the weed burden in the surface. At least that's been my experience. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there was another system which was sort of getting developed during the late 80s, early 90s. It was called bedtime cultivations. And
bedtime.
The basis of this is that you only do cultivations in the dark because seeds need a split second, a microsecond of light in order to germinate. So when you disturb seeds, you bring them to the surface, they get a little bit of light that encourages them to germinate. If you do it in the dark, and this is really difficult because often there's light pollution, but there were machines that were trying to develop that could completely envelop the area you're cultivating. And there was some quite interesting research done and some pretty positive results actually in terms of bedtime cultivation.
Just can't get the staff, that's the problem.
But you know, the technology wasn't around at the time. Maybe it would come back. I think it has some real future. I think it should be developed again.
It's actually a thing.
I don't know why it ran out of fashion, probably lack of grants. You know? But yeah, bedtime cultivations it's called. I mean, you could go out and do it in the middle of the night, but you have to choose a night when there's no moon, which may not fit if you're biodynamic, you know, might be doing it at the wrong time. So there are some practical difficulties with doing it.
So it's basically about allowing, well, that's what Toller says is really interesting, but what the false seedbeds is about getting flushes of weeds to germinate, creating a seedbed which will germinate the weed seed, and then another one, then another one. I know some big carrot growers that well, they encourage, they're literally doing it for months before, from February right through till, when do you say carrots? May or something. Yeah, just trying to reduce the weed burden. So it definitely pays. So, I don't know, I can't remember what day it is, but yeah. So it's just about reducing the weed. I mean, we've got to, if we don't do that, you know, if we don't try and reduce the weed burden before the final crop, we're up against it. We're up against it anyway. If we don't do that, it's tricky. So it's counter to what most people are saying. You know, don't do any tillage, keep everything. But it doesn't. The no tillage thing. I don't know. Let's not get started on no tillage.
One of the key things as well is understanding that weeds, is it 90% of annual weeds only germinate in the top 1.5 of 1.5 centimeters of soil. Yeah. So any weeding action, or especially if you're doing stale seedbed or full seedbed, or if you're doing interplant hoeing, or if you're going out, you know, even if you're just cultivating, if you keep your cultivation, if you're doing a weeding operation, keep it as shallow as possible. However, what becomes tricky with that, and this is a big problem, is like, you know, all the theory of how to best look after your soil, best to deal with annual weeds, but then when you mix that in with perennial weeds, so when you've got a creeping thistle or a cooch problem or a dock problem, and then you want to go in deeper and hit those deep roots on those plants, or definitely with thistle and dock, that is where there are two conflicting things. So what we tend to try and do, or best of all, is deal with the perennial weeds with some deep weeding, but accept that you're not going to get rid of any of those pernicious weeds in one season. So give them a good knockback before and early on in the crop, then just accept that they're going to be there, and they offend the eye a lot. You know, the other name for couch grass is twitch. You know, and I'm sure that is because whenever you see it as a grower, you want to go and get the weeding kit out and deal with it. But I think, you know, having a whole season approach to how you're going to weed a crop, not just reacting all the time. So if you've got perennial weed issues, have a plan, you know, knock them back at key times. With all of those things, generally, once the crop's mature, maybe not onions and carrots, but if it casts shade, there's very few plants that thrive in shade. You know, cooch pretty much stops under a potato canopy or under a brassica canopy. So hit the perennials really early, but then go back into kind of annual mode and make your cultivations a bit shallower, or your weeding actions a bit shallower, deal with the annuals.
And you kind of led into my question, but I was wondering what your approaches are after harvest. So when you've cropped out a bed or a field, what techniques you're using until your next cropping cycle? Are you doing any tilling? Are you green manuring, whatever it is?
Well, in our situation, after most harvests, we've got a green manure in place because we're undersowing most of our crops. We're only not undersowing 1 year out of 5 within the cropping rotation. So we've always got a ground cover in there. So we don't do anything. I mean, nothing at all. I mean, if we've got brassicas, we're harvesting brassicas right for the winter. That's now all undersown with 4 or 5 different species of plant. When we get to spring, the brassicas will cut, will regrow. They'll generate massive amount of green manure. They'll generate lots of biodiversity through flowering. They'll help the life cycle of the predatory wasp, which kills all the caterpillars. That stays in place. If you showed me that 30, 40 years ago, I would have said this looks really messy and really bad farming. But now I look at this thing, this is really beautiful because I don't have to worry about my soil. I don't have to worry about my biodiversity. I don't have to worry about where my fertility is coming from because it's always there. So actually, the answer to your question is we almost do nothing. Now, where we're taking out potatoes, which we finished a couple of weeks ago, that's gone into green manure because that's going to preserve fertility over winter. It's also going to control weeds. Where we planted squash in June, that was undersown with an all-species mixture of over 30 different plants. That was undersown during July. That'll be there for the next 2 years. That's my main fertility building crop. So after cropping, it's nearly always something already there, or we put a green manure in straight away. We're not double cropping any land in the field. We're doing a bit of double cropping in tunnels, obviously triple even, but not in the field.
Yeah, we just leave the weeds. It's our, as I say, we don't have any, we're not doing any green manuring except over winter, but we've got a pretty good, by the end of the crop, we've got a pretty good ground cover of weeds. But that observation that Tolly mentioned of the predatory, because if you sow successions of brassicas, like probably we all do, we have literally no problems with cabbage white or anything like that ever. Do you? Is that what that's what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, continual cropping of cabbages actually gives you a guarantee that there's always predators there. Yes, when you stop cropping them, the predator pisses off, it doesn't come back. There's always a time lag between a pest landing in your farm and its predator coming behind it. A really good example of that is leek moth. I mean, we've all experienced leek moth about 7 or 8 years ago. It came in. The first year was pretty bad. We were chucking out 1/3 of our leeks. The second year we were chucking out maybe 20%. And the third year we hardly noticed it. We never see it now. And I can only assume, I've got no evidence, but I can only assume that either one of our natural indigenous predators here moved into the challenge or the predator came with it. But the problem's not there. And that's down to having the right diversity for that predator to hang out of. And it's all about green manures, ground. I mean, weed control cannot be considered in isolation. You know, weed control is part of the whole system. It's part of fertility building, crop management. Looking at weed control as a single issue is a seriously dodgy way of looking at weed control. I mean, this is what we're here for today, looking at weed control. But we cannot look at weed control without considering every other part of the farm system. I think that's the important thing. We cannot consider what we do on our farm in little boxes. We have to join all this up together into one giant organism, if you like, for want of a better way of explaining it.
Do you have any specific comments about mare's tail? And maybe I should put it another way. What should we avoid doing to make the problem worse?
We don't have it.
I've never had to deal with mare's tail.
Don't take on land with mare's tail, I think is. It thrives on compacted, poorly drained land. So that gives you some idea of what you may do. First, you improve the compaction issue, and then you improve the drainage. You do all that through a whole systems approach, which includes some cultivation, some green manuring, and improvement of organic matter. I mean, it's a difficult one. You won't get rid of it in less than 5 years. It's a very difficult one to get rid of.
Sorry, it's actually a quick follow-up to Tolly. What mix do you undersow your brassicas with?
It depends a bit on what I've got in the seed cupboard. I call it green alchemy. I go and pull out all my green manure seeds, put them in a pile, see what I've got, and then make something up out of that. So this year, what we've got Phacelia, we've got yellow trefoil, we've got a bit of ryegrass. I mean, ryegrass is great because it grows so well in any condition. And we've also got some crimson red clover. So we've got 4. And there's some weeds, of course, that's okay. So it varies every year. What I try not to do is to get too hooked on any one particular thing, because I think, you know, fetishism is not always healthy. If it's to do with weeds, it's definitely not healthy.
If you're scaling up from using wheel hose and such like to using tractor hose on a tractor, what advice could you give for choosing, you know, choosing the equipment? Is there any particular type of, you know, spring tines or duck's foot or?
Well, I've got a list of what the first thing I bought was a Littleton rolling cultivator, which is quite a good machine. You can chuck lots of soil around and chuck soil in the base of the plant, and it also weeds the wheelings a bit. I don't know whether that's going to help, but then I bought an Einbock. It's called a chop style, probably the best thing I ever bought, and that's just got duck's feet on spring tines, and it has finger weeders that run behind. So it does in the row, but I quite like the duck's feet on sprung tines. That does a pretty good job. Does that help? I mean, I've got, what was the next thing I bought? I bought, well, I got a steerage hoe. Both of those machines are steered by the tractor driver. Just have got to drive in the right place. And the mechanical planting is important. You may all know this already, so forgive me, but if you don't plant with a machine, the machine naturally follows the topography of the land, the slopes in both directions. So if you don't plant with the machine, the weeding machines, which also follow the tractor, don't follow them. It's very, very difficult to weed them. If you just put in if you put in straight lines of string and plant your plants and try and drive down, it's impossible. You can't do it. Well, I think it's impossible. So that's quite important. The mechanical planting is important for the weeding. The steerage hoe, you've obviously got somebody, either a robot or a person, steering the steerage hoe. But I think you need to be perfectly honest, I think you need all these machines. For example, I won't go on to one, but I have a steerage hoe which I've got high-sided blades on, which are rigid. Actually, they're not sprung; they're rigid, and they deflect the soil away from the crop. So I use it for hoeing carrots very early, and because you don't want the sprung tines and A shares will just bury your crop. So you need something that's going to take the soil away. So I couldn't do without my steerage hoe. I couldn't do without the spring tines. And recently I bought a harrow. I bought a couple of harrows because they're supposed to be good on in-row weeding, which they are, but they are, yeah. I won't go. Does that help?
Going from wheel hose to tractor operator is quite a scary experience. I know I did it. And at the back of your mind, you're really scared you're going to fuck the soil up basically with the tractor. So the thing to be conscious of is that you can do an awful lot of damage with a tractor and the wrong equipment at the wrong time if you get it wrong. So you need to be aware of that. I mean, Richard's made some really interesting points. Well, yeah, we got steerage hose. We've got a couple of steerage hoses for different jobs. We've got some with discs on the back, so we can put a little ridge on young leeks. The tool I really like the best of everything on all our equipment is a hydraulic top link. Who's got hydraulic top link? You got hydraulic top link?
I'm dreaming of that.
Right, you've got to get one. Once you've got a hydraulic top link, everything changes because you can tweak it as you go along.
No.
But you got to get one. They're less than 200 quid. You wonder why you ever manage to raise it, because you can change the depth of machinery as you go to suit different conditions, different weed levels, different needs of the crop. It's a really useful bit of kit. So if you're going to get a tractor, get a hydraulic top link as well. You really will benefit from that. It's more important than Bedtime.
I think one just touched, like, especially if you're coming into it, a technique that you don't really see much used in market gardening. The phrase I love is "don't look back weeding," which is essentially using grass. Like Richard mentioned, an Einbok, which is a grass harrow. There's now a company called Treffler that are on the market, very visible everywhere. Grass harrow is essentially a lot of veg weeding. You talk about weeding either side of a crop. Now, when you get onto field scale, you can, especially good with Brassicas, you wait until your brassica plants are rooted, and essentially the phrase is they resist a tug. So if you give them a slight tug and they don't come out, and they've gone in as transplants and the roots have taken, you then get the tension on a grass harrow at the point where it's aggressive enough to take all the annual weeds out, but not so aggressive that it pulls the plug plants out. And it actually, sometimes it will shred the leaves on young cabbages, but they'll just grow straight through it. And that hits the inline weeds, hits everything behind you, everything that goes over. So you're not weeding either side of the crop, you're weeding the whole bed, and that does the inline weeds as well. A bit scary. If
they do also pull out the crop a bit, but you've just got to get. That's why you don't look back. You just got to. You've got to get used to losing a few plants.
Yeah, what's the phrase is, if you're not killing some, you're not weeding close enough. Good phrase.
No one's mentioned the double H word yet. Double H word is hand harrowing. Yeah. Now we got no dig. Despite what everybody thinks about me, I actually quite support no dig. What I don't like about no dig is when you plaster, 50 ton per square meter of material on top. We got no dig, so we're using hand hoeing. I mean, hand hoeing is an incredibly effective way of controlling weeds. And despite all our, not terribly high-tech equipment, but good useful equipment, we sometimes do have to hand hoe even in the field. And we would expect to do that every other year, maybe on Brassicas, if you don't get the timing right. There's a lot you can do with a hand hoe. It's important you know how to use it, and you've got skilled people, and you're not trying to kill every single weed. So hand hoeing is still a legitimate way of dealing with weeds. We do it less now than we ever used to because we've got better at using machinery, but we still do occasionally go back on hand hoeing. On raised beds, on no dig, it's the only way of controlling weeds unless you're going to plaster it with a whole lot of obnoxious materials. So you have to accept hand hoeing. Very shallow, it's still no dig. It's just very shallow hoeing.
I've forgotten about, we always, there's hardly been a year when we haven't hand weeded our carrots. We might not get over the whole crop because there's grow too many, but we always hand weed our carrots. And I've got one of those bed weeder things, that carries people. They're quite good when it's not broken.
When you've got enough people.
When you've got enough people. It'll take 9 people, but you can't find 9 people in the neighbourhood.
I mean, every organic grower knows that carrots are going to be a weed issue, always. No matter how well you get it, some years do better than others, you will always have to do a bit of hand weeding. And, it's about how long it takes. So we look at a row, and I usually go out and test it first. If it takes me half an hour to do a row, I know it's doable. 150 metres in half an hour is good. If it's taking me half a day, we scrap it, we do it again, we drill it again. I mean, this year I scrapped 2 carrot crops because of weed problems and drilled them again. Sometimes it's just not worth spending all your labour on one crop, because when you're doing that, the weeds are getting away somewhere else. That's the other thing we haven't talked about is prioritisation.
Yeah, it's critical.
You've got to walk across all your crops pretty regularly, at least once or twice a week, and look at the one which is going to be the biggest weed problem. And you always tackle the one with the biggest weed problem first. Because by the time you've dealt that one, the one over there, which wasn't a big weed problem, may well be by the time you get to it. So you have to prioritise how you're going to deal with these weeds. And sometimes it's a bit of a guessing game. And, it's not all about intuition. Sometimes it's just about pure luck, getting it right. And if you get it wrong, so what? You drill it again.
There's also time. Two conflicting bits of advice when I started growing. One was from a very old supermarket veg grower. And the phrase he used was, if now's the time, drop everything and go and do it. Which is very true sometimes. It can be a Sunday morning, you're planning to go out and do stuff with your family, and there's rain coming for a week,
do it. Yeah.
and one quick weed hit will buy you the next 3 weekends with your family. The conflicting bit of advice is you never finish the jobs list, go home, relax, and pick it up in the morning. Both those phrases have got a bit of truth, you know, and I think it's up to you to decide which one applies. But back to the timing thing with weeds, getting in and getting a good weed, and the weather, you know, we haven't even mentioned this yet, weeding, using the weather to your weeding advantage. You know, there is actually, having said that, dash out and weed before the rain, it's actually not generally a very good time to weed, because the rain just waters back in all the weeds and they just start growing again. Chickweed especially, you're just relocating it in those conditions, you're not weeding it. The best time to weed is on the morning of a really sunny day. You know, and you might want to go out planting everything. It's like spring madness, isn't it? When you've got loads and loads of young plants and all you want to do is go out and plant plants all week. You know, you've got queues and queues and queues of plants to go in. Well, I always thought it's really important to get your first round of crops planted, pause, go back round, weed all your first crops, and then go and start planting your second load of crops. You know, a lot of farmers only have one tractor. You can only be planting or weeding. And you might be, we've got the planter on, let's just carry on planting, let's just carry on planting. And at that point, you might well have left the first crops that have gone in. By the time you've done all of the plug trays that are on the hardening off bay, and you go and put the weeding kit on, those first few lots of crops you put in, the weeds have gone beyond mechanical weeding, and then you got to get in there and do a hand weed. So just the balance of planting, weeding is really important. But everyone gets spring fever, just wants to keep on planting. So that's quite important. Yeah.
If you get a window to do something, you've got to do it. It's as simple as that, isn't it? Somebody told me that, you know, if you've got to go to a funeral, even if it's your own, you can't go. That's what he said to me. You've still got to do the weeding. You've got to get out there. It's true, actually. If you miss the opportunity, obviously, if it's your own funeral, you don't have to worry, but you never get another chance. This happens so many times. I mean, you probably all know this, yeah.
It's difficult, isn't it? Especially with new entrants and younger growers. You know, we've got lots of apprentices on the farm where I work. There's a lot of talk about work-life balance, and it is really, really important. But you have chosen to be a farmer, and that is not a 5-day-a-week job. That's a job that's seriously based around weather. And if you don't react around weather and go out and hit the right weather patterns for the job you want to do, you know, maybe you are in the wrong industry. You know, you cannot have every weekend off if you want to be a really good grower, because the weather is not a 5-day-a-week thing. You know, I think it's really important to be, especially field scale, it's really important to be honest about that and realistic. And if you want a 5-day-a-week job and you want every weekend off, don't get into field scale veg, basically. You know, especially in the spring, you know. And the other thing I find with that is a field scale grower, if you absolutely nail spring, summer is much, much easier. If you go, I want to have a few weekends off in the spring and go out with all my mates in the spring, your season goes on and on and on. It doesn't have a lull where you can go out and have a good time. It's a seasonal job. Nail the hectic parts of the season, and you buy yourself the quiet times of the season.
Have you got some friends to go out with then?
No, my wife keeps me in contact.
I've been working so hard, I haven't got any friends. That's true.
Hi there, I've got a question for everyone on the table, basically. I used to manage Cleveland's just down the road. Sort of going back to what was getting discussed at the start about having the sort of weeds in the beds and being comfortable with them and them being beneficial, and about undersowing as well. And my experiences of having weeds in the beds and undersowing, I found it really hard up here because it sort of created an environment for sort of mildew and other sort of diseases to sort of be encouraged in the beds. So keeping beds as weed-free as possible. And I get what was being said, but my experiences were telling me to, I was terrified of having weeds in the beds because it made the environment more moist and encouraged mildew, certainly on things like spring onions and lettuces and spinaches. I'm just curious which crops you've had success leaving weeds in.
Well, I wouldn't undersow any of those crops for the reasons you stated. So we're undersowing mostly field veg, so all the brassicas. Onions we don't undersow. We do undersow leeks. So we're looking more at overwintered veg. So we're not really undersowing until quite late in the summer. So we're having stale weed control right up until maybe end of July, and then we're undersowing, by which time mildew is not really a big problem in the autumn for those sorts of crops. So we're not, I mean, there's no way you can undersow lettuce because we're only in the ground for 6 weeks, you know, but what you do have, you have a rotation which allows for fertility building in other ways using green manures. So there are crops which we wouldn't undersow, and it is primarily the smaller scale crop which I think you're talking about.
I think we're trying to control weed as best we can. It's just that if you've got 30 acres or something, we're doing what you're doing, but probably you just can't do it quite so well. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes you have a lot of weeds. That's how it is. I'm not actively encouraging the weeds. So, I'm not planting them, but that's getting the balance. Yeah.
I have got a few questions that have come up on the online chat. We'll just take a few of these. Any advice for controlling weeds in tractor wheelings without excessive cultivation and compaction? Are there any successful species for undersowing in the wheelings? Had especially a bad problem with knotgrass and onions, which had been weeded well. So I think the weeds that are appearing in the wheelings rather than within the crop itself.
That depends a bit on the system. If you're on a true bed system where you have maybe very wide beds and you've got true wheelings, then yes, that can be a problem. And the way to get around that is either by cultivations behind the tractor wheels, where you have just a single tine that breaks the tractor wheeling up, or you establish a more permanent clover strip, which would stay in place for the whole of that season. Knotgrass, is that? Red shank? No.
Knotgrass, I don't know.
What's knotgrass?
I don't know, I've not heard.
Sounds like knotgrass.
It must be a
colloquial name for something.
Yeah.
But wheelings weeds are a problem.
Hello?
Wheelings weeds are not to be underestimated. They can make a right old mess. Well, not a mess, obviously. That's just slipping into my former. But I just bought a wheelings weeder that I drag around.
Yeah.
I've got front-mounted hoe, which allows you to have a wheelings weeder behind. That's been quite good.
Another question for you, Richard, is are you willing to impart everybody here on your technique for attacking black nightshade?
Hey, that's somebody who knows me. No, there's well.
It was from Tom Naracaro.
Well, we had last year. We had really. I mean, we had a nightshade virtually wall to wall in a field where I wanted to grow parsnips this year. I'm not joking. I've never seen anything like it. So I described earlier how I sort of ploughed it and then power harrowed it and power harrowed it, and that was to try and get the nightshade to germinate and to reduce the level of nightshade. And I have to say, it worked. But I knew that I was putting in actually, no, it wasn't. When did I sow well, I knew I had a window with the parsnips. When did I sow them? The end of May. I had a bit of a gap. I had a period where I could try and germinate some nightshade. It actually carries on germinating after that, unfortunately. But the rest of it was in an area of brassicas, which I knew I'd be able to control it with machinery. So,
I mean, that's the point. You know, some crops are a whole lot easier for weed control than others, and brassicas come to mind. I mean, there's no, you know, I saw pictures of people planting brassicas into plastic mulch. What the hell would you want to do that for? You know, it's such an easy crop to control weeds.
But I mean, nightshade, you just have to pull it up. We did quite a lot of pulling up of nightshades, even in the Brassicas. You know, I wouldn't want to give the impression we don't do a lot of crawling about. We do, and but it's amazing what 3 or 4 people can do in a day crawling about. So they can do a lot.
I'd back that up massively. It is amazing. With a really committed attitude and a few committed people, you can cover a lot. You know, especially we talk about all these good techniques to get hold of weeds. Sometimes it just rains for 6 weeks in a row, and everything goes past two leaf weed stage, and it's got to be pulled out aggressively. You know, and the theory goes out the window, and economics comes in the window, and you need a crop to sell, and you all just get your waterproofs on, you crawl out the field, and you hand weed. You know. And that's not on the scales we're at, maybe not. I mean, Richmond it's a big area to do the whole thing like that, but you've always got to have that in your back pocket, that if it gets out of hand, you're just going to go in there. More normally, this is like inline weeds I'm talking about here. And you can cover a lot of meterage hand weeding in a day. You know?
I'm going to have to go. I've got a train to catch. Sorry.
See you. Alex, good to see you.
We'll just do, there's quite a lot of questions that have come through on the chat, but what I'll do is we'll get them to the panelists at some point, and maybe if you can just note down a few answers, and then we can send them out with the recordings and everything. But I will just ask 1 or 2 more. Has the panel any experience of a min-till system using spaders for primary cultivations to reduce the weed burden? Spaders.
No, I've never used spaders.
Okay. Is there a reason why you wouldn't?
Well, it was a spader on the farm when I arrived, and I've never used it. I think I've got into. They're quite. Maybe I just haven't seen them used. I found it quite a clumsy tool.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure the spader.
And moved. Everything's based around kind of shallow power harrowing now, and I still use a plough. So I think, I'm
not sure a spader is minimum till anyway, is it?
No.
Not what I've seen anyway. They don't look very min-till.
It's gentler than a power harrow or a rotavator, isn't it? I think a spader, but it's not minimum till. Yeah.
We sold it to Guy, works for us. Oh, sorry, we sold the spader to Guy, works for us, and he uses it just to put in Brian Vetch. He said it's fantastic. He uses a lot of winter Brian Vetch, but for flails, puts the spader through, but uses this for controlling weeds. That's what he says. And it don't work with stones.
Yeah, I haven't seen them.
And just for the last one, any recommendations on a green manure for overwintering to be put in now? This isn't, it's for in a walled garden, and they're looking to convert to organic, so it's in conversion at the moment. They've suggested winter rye, but is there anything else?
Well, that's all we do. I mean, we haven't put ours in yet. I'm still hoping I will, but.
I use Facelia at this time of year quite a lot. You're running out of options at this time of year as far as what's going to germinate, establish, and do the job of an overwintering green manure. And I think, almost by this time of year, you really are. You're on rye vetch, but Facelia, a lot of people don't want to use because it's all the catalogue say it's frost tender. I've never had a Facelia crop killed by frost, and we've had seriously hard frosts in the last 4 or 5 years. I think that the not frost hardy thing about Facelia is when it's this big and it gets a frost, and that'll kill it. If it's this big, it doesn't die in frost. The lovely thing about Facelia is an overwintered green manure is you before, depending on what you want to follow that ground with, you get this huge added bonus that in the spring, very early on in the spring, before natural wildflowers have flowered, you get a massive flowering crop that brings in pollinators and predators from all around into your cropping area. And then as the natural flowers take over, they stay there and do the jobs they're meant to do. And the other thing about Facelia is it germinates very easily in trashy ground. So at this time of year, as far as establishing a lovely seed bed for a green manure, it gets harder and harder and harder. There's less dry days to desiccate trash. So to have something that doesn't mind germinating a bit of trash, I use Facelia a lot as a last green manure.
any more questions from the floor? Okay, we've exhausted it. That's great. Well, I'd just like to say a very quick thank you to the panel, to Ian in his absence, Richard, Andy. I personally have found that really insightful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions that have come through on the chat, but as I say, we'll try and get some answers out to those ones that have remained unanswered. I think it's clear to say there is no silver bullet out there as regards weed control. It's not one size fits all, but I think let's have a round of applause for thanking the panel for sharing some of their findings and methods with us today.
It'd be quite good to, I don't know if there's going to be any feedback, but it'd be quite good to know what you thought about the no presentation thing. Whether you think it's a good thing or you're wondering what we're doing here kind of thing. Because, yeah, it would be interesting to know. I think this is better personally, but.
So having more of an open dialogue than presentations.
Nobody listens to a presentation for more than 60 seconds though. That's the stats, isn't it? It's the switch off. That's the problem.
Depends how good the presentation is.
Yeah, that would have been, yeah. Yeah, I can text, yeah.
Good. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for making my job very easy.